Hello, this is Kevin Stoda, and welcome back for the second part of my narration. Excuse me, second part of part one of my narrations about living in Central Europe in 1989 when the wall came down. I'm continuing with the story of the students in my college or University of Wuppertal, who were um, happy about the events that were happening in Tiananmen Square, especially in April and early May, actually through late May. They were very excited. And I'll begin with that story and remind you of why we're focusing on Tiananmen Square when we talk about the revolutions of 1989 in Europe. Uh, let's talk about the broken telephone episode. In May 1989, in my dormitory at the university, if one doesn't reflect or recall history in order of time or on a continuum or river of history very well, you'll forget little events that you experienced at the time that may be not in the media or the memory of official histories that you know of, like in textbooks. Let me remind you that the protest in Tiananmen Square began in the weeks just prior to a visit that was planned and undertaken by Soviet leadership. Mikhail Gorbachev, the premier. He was intending to visit China in May 1989 to work out some deals with the communist China and work on a better relationship with communist China. This is important to note because it's often said in the West that Reagan's military buildup led to the fall of communism, but really it was a lot to do with Mikhail Gorbachev and what was happening in the Soviet Union. The purpose of those talks between China and Russia, Soviet Union, was to end 30 years of fighting or estrangement between the two largest communist behemoths of the Asian continent. Note, perhaps had the two sides buried the hatchet a decade earlier, world history would have been greatly different. Um, I want to also say, quite possibly, the Soviet Union um, would have added a capitalist element to its economic development a decade earlier. It would have slowed down the collapse of the Soviet system immensely too. Uh, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as you know, took place 2 years later. By the time Gorbachev arrived in mid to late May, um, Chinese students had built in Tiananmen Square a large statue. The statue was called Lady Liberty, or the Goddess of Liberty. Um, and they were in a celebratory mood, not just in China. The students felt they were edge of a new end of a yin and yang. This is when history changes, according to Chinese mythology of history, that there will be a big turning over, like you see in Tai Chi and other um, yoga, that everything will turn upside down. And people were anticipating it. And of course, the communist Chinese were not supporting it. By the time Gorbachev arrived in mid to late May in China, Chinese students had the world's attention. Everybody was looking at China and wondering if the communists would collapse. This happened throughout May, and the confused Chinese communist controlled leadership had not struck down the protesters. Chinese youthful pride, vigor, and hopefulness was flowing everywhere that spring. I could see it all over the European continent, at schools, at college, public demonstrations, and even at the university where I was at, and where I broke bread with students from China quite often in our kitchens that we had shared in the dormitory. Um, in this pre in this pre-revolutionary atmosphere, um, a sort of pre-internet technological miracle occurred in my West German dormitory. Namely, the West German government, Deutsche Telekom's own public-run telephone system, broke down in the dormitory building, and hundreds of students, many of them Chinese, stood in line for well over 72 hours period in late May, early June, calling their friends and families all over the world because it was for free. So they were able to keep up to date right about the time of the crackdown of what was going on. They were able to get constant feedback from friends, family, and everybody was speaking openly and sharing from east to west information like never before through that little telephone uh, that was in our building. Due to this technological accident or miracle, unbelievable amounts of up-to-date information were being shared, which included what was happening on the ground in Tiananmen, what the Western press was doing on in Europe and elsewhere. It was as if the internet had been invented, and millions of pieces of new information about one's homeland were suddenly available to these Chinese at the British University, all for free. Finally, as June 1989 arrived, the telephone system at my dormitory went back to the way it used to be, and you couldn't make free calls. But because of the important events, the Chinese were still lined up calling their family and friends. The tones of these Chinese people calling home, however, became cries of anger, of frustration, and of pain. It was on June 3rd and June 4th, 1989, that the happiness and joy of the Chinese students in Germany disappeared quickly in a trail of tears, running all through the corridors of my campus dormitory in Wuppertal. The Chinese cracked down quickly. Thousands of students and supporters were arrested, hundreds killed, and many more disappeared in Beijing in a matter of hours. After 2 days of crying and tears, fears of reprisal and fears of spies on the campus swept through the Chinese communities in West Germany and especially on the Wuppertal campus. People who had been open about what was happening, talking about their friends and family, suddenly went silent. This eerie silence loomed everywhere. Chinese were afraid of being ratted up on by their peers, or that things would get back home to their government and they would lose their chance to work abroad or to return home. The silence of the Chinese in the corridors of my dormitory was deafening. I mean, it was an eerie silence. However, this same silence also sent fear and forced changes along many uh, locations in Eastern Europe. And calls for reform and at an urgent pace increased because of the crackdown. Let me explain. People want to know, how would Eastern Europe respond to the crackdown in China? In summary, the same silence, sadness, and hopelessness relating to the June 4th Tiananmen Square massacres continued to reverberate in Eastern Europe. The responses were varied. Dr. Mark Jansen, who served in East Berlin as both a theological student at Humboldt University between 1988 and 1991, was also serving as the eyes and ears of the Mennonite Central Committee and for the Mennonite churches of Europe at the time, during this time of greatest change in modern Eastern European history. In his own book, The Wrong Side of the Wall, An American in East Berlin During the Time of the Peaceful Revolutions, published in 1993, Jansen noted that the massacre of youthful seekers of democracy in China left its imprint in the peaceful movements for democratic change in Eastern Europe through the rest of 1989. In short, as October and November 1989 rolled around, the ghost of Tiananmen Square would float like a phantom over the river of history in the minds of those involved with the decisions for making peaceful protests, as well as in the hearts of East German communist leaderships alike. Uh, Poland responded in 1989 by quickly producing stamps recognizing the victims of Tiananmen Square. Meanwhile, East Germany was celebrating the 40th anniversary of its very existence in 1989, so the totalitarian government led by communist Erich Honecker was expecting a visit in early October 1989 by the Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. The students prepared to do the same as the Chinese. Everyone wondered throughout the summer of 1989 how Honecker and his communist cohorts would respond to similar student and youthful protests, if such protests were permitted to rise there. One response to both Tiananmen and the opening of Poland to democracy that year was clear, though. Um, East Germans began to vote more and more with their feet. That means they got up and left the country starting that May 1989. First, they took advantage of a change in Hungary's relationship with the West, which had already been occurring for decades. The Hungarian communist leadership and neighboring Austria made a deal, and they tore down their barbed wire fences, which separated them. They did this by late spring 1989. Suddenly, thousands of East Germans and, could cross over the border quickly from Hungary into Austria. Would go to the country of Hungary on holiday, and they would sneak across the border in small groups or in mass. They would do it in daytime or nighttime. The similar sort of activities would take place continuing throughout the fall. There would be attempts to leave through Poland. There would be attempts to leave through Czechoslovakia. The hemorrhaging was enormous for Eastern German leadership as September 1989 came around. They were not posing any crackdown, possibly for two very different reasons. One reason was Mikhail Gorbachev was coming, and they didn't want to crack down before that, because Mikhail Gorbachev is the father of glasnost and reform, and they did not want him to turn around and not show up for their big party in October. So that was one thing. The other thing could be the generation was changing. Erich Honecker and his cadre were the last of a few who were willing to crack down on their own people. They had known 1953 when uh, East Berlin riots had taken place and there was a crackdown. They had built the wall, but now a younger generation was coming to the fore, and they had ways of meeting together, organizing together like never before, and they were willing to stand up. And slowly, during the 1980s, the East German government had allowed more and more of these secret meetings to take place, almost as though they were saying, we don't want to put our children in jail anymore. We look at China, we don't want to do that. So I think in the back of many in the leadership's mind, not the highest levels, but many other levels, they were thinking, we don't want the Chinese option. We don't want the Tiananmen Square. In short, this is what leads me to conclude this portion of my oral histories of 1989. And I hope you follow me on YouTube and continue enjoying this. Again, this is Kevin Stoda, and please watch the next portions of this series on the revolutions of 1989, and sign up and be a member. Okay. Thank you. Vic, how do I put my program on now?